Archives are important because they preserve the diversity of the world. They preserve the diversity of thought that we have. They preserve the diversity of literacy and how things have changed over time. And it's very easy, especially these days, to think that there's only one way of thinking or to be overwhelmed by dominant perspectives and the nuance is lost. And archives preserve the nuance, both the nuance of today for the future and the nuance of the past for today.
The most moving document I've ever found in an archive connects to the First World War. It's a collection of letters that belongs to a soldier's family. So you go through it and you begin to read letters that this young soldier is writing home, and then you read letters that his relatives are writing to him, his mother, his grandfather, and you get a sense of the family dynamics, and they love each other. You know, it's a really happy family. And then he goes and he fights in Beaumont Hamel, and he dies in Beaumont Hamel. So it's really sad. The last letter in the collection is dated July 18th. More than 2 weeks have passed since that battle. It's a letter from his mother, and she's writing him to ask if he's okay. She says, "I haven't heard from you for a long time. I know you fought in a big battle. I'm checking the casualty lists every day. I haven't seen your name. Just send me a letter so I know you're okay." And that letter, next to it is the envelope that it was sent in, and it was returned to her in that envelope, and the word "dead" is written on it in red ink. I mean, it's heartbreaking, and that collection, it encapsulates just the sadness and the tragedy of Beaumont Hamel, how it affected families, and by extension society, in a way that just anyone could relate to in a really powerful way.
It is important to balance a sense of privacy and to have an ethical awareness that you're venturing into the lives of other people, possibly without their consent, often in the case of traces from people who are no longer with us. So in the archival material that I work with, it does come from a family and concerns personal letters that are exchanged within the family, and I'm very aware of finding myself in an intimate space shared amongst this family that wasn't created for outside observers.
I remember the first time I ever saw a crew list, and we pulled out the crew list that was going to go on display, and it blew my mind. Seeing all of those names, like we've all seen lists of names, attendance sheets, or, you know, guest books, but to picture all these guys from very different backgrounds living on a ship for 2 years or more. And, you know, I think of living in residence as like super cramped quarters with people who are very different from me. But, you know, it's nothing like being on a boat in the middle of the Pacific where you can't see land for 2 years and you have to figure out a way to get along. And, you know, aside from the fact that you're at risk, I mean, like, often these crew lists are the only written legacy of these guys. The death rate for sailors in the 19th century and the 18th century and even today is really high. So we don't know how many of these guys ever made it back to shore, but we do know their names. And that is really both deeply moving, but also so important for us to remember.
On the other hand, I think that as we reach farther back into time, it becomes true that people are representatives of the period in which they live. If you reach very far back into the past, there are traces of people 100,000 years ago in Ethiopia that are very important for us to understand the history of the human species. As we move ahead into the modern period, something similar could be said. People who lived in the 15th and 1600s give us some kind of an insight into that time. They become representative of the time in which they live, and I think that it's part of the social contract that we live with, that in the future we will be representatives of the time that we're living in right now.
The difference between genealogical research and autoethnographic research is something that's very current to my own project. My family thinks I'm doing genealogical research. Genealogical research to me is about dates and names. It's about filling in the blank spaces in a family tree. Autoethnographic research takes those names and dates, but then wants to see them within a larger context, wants to say, okay, so why is this happening here? Why is this happening now? Why is this happening to this individual person? And what is the afterlife of those names and dates? How do those names and dates, wherever they occurred, and in my particular family background, they go back to Africa, to India, to the Netherlands, to Germany, to South America, to Canada. What happens when you bring all of that together? What happens, and what is the context in which I am living the result of that genealogy? So the autoethnography is about the larger context and meaning.
I've had a few surprising finds over the years. A few really stand out. One is when I was researching Perished, the Sealing Book. I was alone in the Maritime History Archive. I worked there, so I was doing research after hours. The lights were dimmed, and there was a file that sort of caught my eye in the catalog. It said Sealer's Ticket. So I pulled it out of a drawer, opened the folder, and sitting inside was this just beautiful red ticket the size of a license plate, and it had a sealer's name on it. And this man had taken this ticket with him to the flows in 1914. He was stranded on the ice floes for 2 nights, and this ticket very likely was with him during that entire disaster. It was all tattered, it was torn, his name was written on it. And to me, it didn't give me any extra information about the disaster, but it drew me into the story. It gave me kind of an intangible punch of knowledge about what he would have gone through during those 2 nights. You know, his ticket was torn. His body would have been torn, you know, sort of brutalized by that experience like his ticket. And that's invaluable, you know, coming away with that from an archive.
I've worked with students mostly in relation to the Smallwood letters, and we looked at particularly at women's letters to Smallwood in the first years following Confederation. And I don't know whether I was as surprised as they were surprised. I don't think my students were expecting to be as surprised as they were. So I had a student who came to me afterwards and said, you know, I had to leave the archives yesterday. And I said, why? And she said, because I was just looking through stuff and I saw a petition, and I saw one of my ancestors, I can't remember, it was a grandmother or a great uncle, I can't remember. I saw their signature on a petition. And suddenly the archive was real to them. It was a real person.